It was a bright morning at JFK Airport in New York. People rushed around the terminal, dragging their suitcases, buying coffee, and looking for their gates. Among the crowd was a young woman named Ava Thompson. She was calm, focused, and dressed in a neat white blouse and black pants. A small badge on her bag read, "Dr. Ava Thompson, Medical Conference 2025. This was an important day for her. It was her first time attending a national medical conference in Los Angeles. She had worked hard for this moment. After years of study, sleepless nights, and saving money, she was finally going to speak at a panel. Her hands clutched the speech notes tightly, but her face stayed peaceful. After checking in and passing security, Ava walked to Gate 7, where her flight was already boarding. She smiled politely at the flight attendant and stepped onto the plane. Inside, she helped an elderly woman struggling with her carry-on. "Let me get that for you," Ava said gently. The woman smiled in return. "Thank you, dear. That's very kind of you." Ava then walked down the aisle to her seat, 14B, a window seat. She placed her bag under the seat, buckled up, and quietly reviewed her speech notes. Everything seemed normal. Just another flight. But the normalcy didn't last long. A few minutes later, a woman entered the cabin. She was in her late 40s, wearing designer sunglasses indoors and carrying a large leather purse. Her face was already scrunched in annoyance. Her name was Karen. Karen looked around, frowned at the people, and muttered, "Of course, it smells weird in here." She slowly walked down the aisle until she reached seat 14A, the one next to Ava. As soon as she saw Ava, she stopped and stared. Her lips curled, her eyebrows raised. Then she said loudly, "Ugh, I'm not sitting next to her." The entire row fell silent. Heads turned. Ava looked up, confused at first. She thought maybe Karen was joking. But the way she was standing, arms crossed, nose in the air, made it clear. A flight attendant quickly walked over. "Is there a problem, ma'am?" she asked softly. "Yes," Karen replied, still loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "I paid for comfort. I didn't pay to sit next to this." Ava's heart dropped. She felt her face grow warm. Her hands, which had just been flipping through her speech notes, began to shake slightly. She kept her head down. The flight attendant looked uncomfortable. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but your seat is 14A. If you'd like to request a change, I can check once everyone is seated." Karen rolled her eyes. "Unbelievable," she muttered, and tossed her bag into the overhead compartment. She sat down roughly next to Ava, arms folded, body turned away as far as possible. No one said a word. A man across the aisle glanced over with raised eyebrows. A woman behind them sighed. But no one spoke up. Ava stayed still. She didn't say a word. She wanted to cry, but she wouldn't give Karen that satisfaction. Instead, she took a deep breath, put on her headphones, and looked out the window. Outside, the plane was preparing to take off. Inside, the air was heavy with tension. Everyone had heard Karen's words. Everyone had seen her actions. But no one stood up for Ava. Not yet. As the engines roared and the plane started to move, Ava closed her eyes for a moment. She thought about her journey, growing up in a small town, being the only black girl in her science classes, working 2 jobs to pay for med school, and still pushing forward. This wasn't the first time someone had tried to make her feel small, but it still hurt. Still, she reminded herself why she was on this flight. She wasn't just anyone. She was Dr. Ava Thompson, and she had earned her seat on the plane and at the conference. But as the plane lifted off the ground, she couldn't help but wonder, how far would Karen go? And would anyone stop her before it was too late? The plane climbed higher into the sky, and for a while, everything seemed calm again. Ava looked out the window, trying to gather her thoughts for her upcoming speech. The clouds outside were soft and white, and the sun bathed the cabin in a golden light. But the peace didn't last. Karen's voice broke through the stillness again. "Excuse me," Karen said, her voice dripping with condescension. "I can't breathe in here with that stench." Ava froze. She had hoped Karen would stay quiet for the rest of the flight, but it was clear now that wouldn't happen. Ava didn't respond. She kept her eyes forward, trying to ignore the sting of Karen's words. But Karen wasn't going to let her off that easy. She began making small noises, sighs, scoffs, and sharp breaths, loud enough for the people around her to hear. Ava's hands were still gripping her speech notes, the paper crinkling under her fingers. She wanted to snap, to say something back, but she knew it would only make things worse. So she stayed silent, focusing on her breath, just trying to get through the flight. But Karen wasn't finished. "I can't believe this is happening," Karen muttered loud enough for everyone around her to hear. She glared at the flight attendant, who was walking by. "This is unacceptable. I demand a different seat. This woman is making it uncomfortable for me." The flight attendant looked hesitant. She had already spoken to Karen once, but clearly it wasn't enough. She bent down and whispered, "Ma'am, we are unable to change seats once we're in the air. Perhaps you could try to relax for the duration of the flight." Relax? Karen wasn't interested in relaxing. She stood up and pointed at Ava, her fingers shaking with anger. "This isn't a joke. I don't want to be near her." The entire cabin grew tense again. Some passengers looked uncomfortable. Others stared at their phones, pretending they didn't hear. Ava could feel their eyes on her. She wanted to shrink into her seat, to disappear, but she couldn't. This wasn't just about her. This was about standing up against the hate she had to endure every single day. Ava took a deep breath. She opened her mouth to speak, to say something that might put an end to this. But just as she was about to, Karen's voice grew louder, cutting her off. "You people always think you're so special. I'm just trying to enjoy my flight, but now I have to sit next to someone like you." Her words cut like daggers. Ava's heart raced. "Someone like me." The words echoed in her mind. Ava could feel the hot sting of tears starting to form in her eyes, but she blinked them back. She wouldn't cry in front of these people. She wasn't weak. Somewhere behind her, a young man whispered to his friend, "Does she have to be like that? It's really uncomfortable." Ava heard the quiet words, but no one dared to speak louder. Karen's behavior had made everyone afraid to act. Karen turned back to Ava with a smirk. "I bet you've never even been to a place like this. You're probably just lucky to be here." The words were venomous, but Ava refused to let them sink in. She took another deep breath, telling herself that Karen's ignorance didn't define her. It didn't change who she was. But Karen wasn't finished yet. She leaned forward again, speaking directly to Ava. "I don't want to be on a plane with someone like you. Do you know how many people are probably uncomfortable because of you? You have no place in these spaces. I've seen people like you in the news, causing problems everywhere." Ava's blood began to boil, but she kept her composure. "Don't react. Don't react," she repeated in her mind. The flight attendants had started to notice the scene and were making their way over. But Karen wasn't done. She raised her voice even louder, her words echoing throughout the cabin. "This is why people like her shouldn't even be allowed to travel like this. I don't care what kind of doctor she is. I don't care about her degree. I don't want to be next to someone like that." The words hit Ava hard. Her hands tightened around her notes. And for a second, she thought she might stand up, walk to the back of the plane, and leave the whole mess behind. But she knew that wouldn't solve anything. Then the worst part happened. Karen's voice softened, but only enough for Ava to hear. "You don't belong here, and you know it. This is for people who matter, people who are worth it." Ava couldn't stay quiet any longer. She was shaking now, but she kept her voice steady as she turned to face Karen. She forced herself to meet Karen's eyes, even though she could feel the sting of humiliation burning inside her. "I do belong here," Ava said quietly, but firmly. "I am worthy, just like everyone else. You don't get to tell me who I am or where I belong." Karen sneered, but the tone of the plane had changed. Passengers started whispering among themselves. Some passengers were starting to notice what was happening. Ava wasn't alone in this anymore. She had started to fight back, even if it was with only her words. The tension in the air was thick, and Ava didn't know what would happen next. Would the flight crew do something? Would anyone else stand up? Ava tried to look past Karen's hateful words, but she couldn't help but wonder, how far would Karen take this? The atmosphere on the plane was suffocating. Passengers glanced nervously at each other, unsure whether to intervene or stay out of it. Ava sat quietly, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped her seat, trying to keep her composure. Karen, however, seemed emboldened by the growing attention, her loud voice cutting through the air. "How did people like you ever get so far?" Karen sneered, looking directly at Ava, her eyes narrow with disdain. "You don't belong in these spaces. You should be grateful you're even allowed on this flight." Her words rang out, sharp and unrelenting. Ava's heart pounded in her chest, but she held her ground. She was proud of the work she had put into becoming a doctor. She had fought so hard to get to this point in her life, but the sting of Karen's words was undeniable. Ava's throat tightened, and for a moment, she felt herself begin to break. But then something inside her snapped. Ava took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling with a slow, steady rhythm. She locked eyes with Karen, refusing to look away. "You don't know anything about me," Ava said, her voice surprisingly calm. "You don't know my story, my struggle, or the sacrifices I've made. And you don't get to tell me where I belong." Karen snorted, her smirk widening. "Oh, I know enough," she said, crossing her arms. "People like you are always so full of excuses, always crying about your struggles. You don't belong in a place like this." Ava was about to say something more when a flight attendant approached, sensing the rising tension. She smiled politely, trying to diffuse the situation. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said to Karen. "Can I offer you a drink or anything to help you feel more comfortable?" But Karen wasn't interested in calming down. "Comfortable," she repeated, scoffing loudly. "How about not sitting next to this?" She gestured at Ava. This woman. The entire cabin had gone silent. The other passengers were clearly watching, but no one had yet spoken up. Ava could feel their eyes on her, some sympathetic, some unsure, but no one intervened. The flight attendant looked awkward but tried again, offering Karen a polite, if nervous, smile. "Ma'am, I understand you're uncomfortable, but you need to calm down. If you'd like, I can arrange a change of seats after we reach cruising altitude." The flight attendant's tone was firm now, but Karen wasn't having it. "I don't need a new seat," Karen snapped. "I need this woman to move. Now." The flight attendant hesitated, looking between the two women. "I'm afraid that's not possible right now, ma'am. The flight is nearly full, and we can't move passengers around mid-flight. Please, try to relax and enjoy your flight." Karen's face turned red with rage. She stood up again, her voice growing louder with each passing second. "This is ridiculous. You let this woman sit here, and now I have to deal with her. Do you know how uncomfortable this is for me? You people should do something." Ava could feel the tension rising to a boiling point. It was clear that Karen wasn't just upset. She was furious, driven by a deep, irrational hatred. Ava clenched her fists in her lap, but she refused to back down. She had been silent for long enough. "Maybe you should look inside yourself, Karen," Ava said, her voice steady but firm. "You're not uncomfortable because of me. You're uncomfortable because of your own ignorance and fear. And that's not my problem." For a brief moment, Karen looked stunned. She wasn't used to being called out so directly. But then her face twisted into a scowl, and she took a step toward Ava. "You should learn your place," she hissed. "And if you don't, I'll make sure everyone knows who you really are. People like you, you're nothing. You don't belong in places like this. You don't deserve to fly first class. You're not worth it." Ava was shaking now, but she stood her ground, her eyes never leaving Karen's. The flight attendants looked nervous but were staying out of it, unsure of how to handle the situation. And then, just when it seemed like Karen would escalate even further, a calm but commanding voice came over the intercom. "Attention, passengers." The voice of the pilot boomed through the cabin, cutting through the tension like a knife. "This is your captain speaking. I want to remind everyone that this is a place of respect and kindness. We will not tolerate any form of harassment or disrespect. If this behavior continues, we will have no choice but to take further action." Everyone fell silent. Ava's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected the pilot to step in, but his words held power. For a moment, Karen looked around, clearly embarrassed. She stood frozen in her place, realizing that the captain's words weren't just a suggestion. They were a warning. The flight attendant quickly walked away, giving Karen a pointed look. Karen huffed and turned back to her seat, muttering under her breath. Ava could see that Karen was still seething with anger, but for now, she had been silenced. Ava allowed herself to exhale, her body finally relaxing a little. She hadn't won the battle, but she had stood her ground. And for the first time since this all started, she felt like she had regained a small victory. However, deep inside, Ava knew this wasn't over. Karen's anger wasn't something that would disappear so easily. The flight might have settled down for now, but Ava couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. What if Karen decided to take her complaints to the authorities? What if she made things worse for Ava when they landed? Ava tried to push those thoughts aside, focusing instead on the calm voice of the captain as the plane flew smoothly through the skies. But in the back of her mind, the question lingered. How far would Karen take this? And would anyone else step in to support Ava if things got worse? As the plane continued its smooth journey above the clouds, the tension in the cabin had momentarily settled. Karen was still visibly angry, but she had returned to her seat, glaring at Ava from time to time. Ava, on the other hand, was now hyper-aware of every sound, every shift in the atmosphere. Despite the captain's intervention, the unease in the air was palpable. The battle hadn't been won yet. It was only paused. Ava tried to focus on the upcoming conference. She needed this. This was her chance to present her research, to prove her worth, and to show that she belonged. But Karen's words kept echoing in her mind. "You don't belong here." She shook her head, pushing the negativity aside. Ava was a doctor. She had worked long and hard to earn her place. The quiet hum of the engines, the soft clinking of glasses as the flight attendants moved through the aisle, brought her back to the moment. She was in the air. She was going to make it. But just as Ava started to relax, there was a sudden shift. The plane jolted slightly, and the overhead lights flickered briefly. Murmurs of concern rippled through the cabin. Ava's heart skipped a beat as she glanced around. It was only a slight turbulence, but it was enough to make the passengers uneasy. The fasten seatbelt sign flickered on. "Ladies and gentlemen." The calm voice of the pilot crackled through the intercom once more. "Please fasten your seatbelts as we are experiencing some light turbulence. We'll be through it shortly. Thank you for your patience." Ava instinctively reached for the seatbelt, clicking it into place as the soft hum of the plane continued to vibrate beneath her. She tried to remain calm, but she could sense the rising discomfort in the air. That's when Karen's voice sliced through the tension again. "You see, this is what happens when you put people like her on a plane. We're all gonna die because of." Karen's words were cut short when the plane dipped slightly, a sudden drop in altitude that caused everyone to jolt forward in their seats. Some passengers gasped, others screamed, but within seconds, the plane leveled out, returning to its steady course. Ava's heart was racing, her grip tight on the armrests, but she fought to stay calm. However, Karen was panicking now. She was gripping her seat, her knuckles white, her eyes wide with fear. She was muttering under her breath, but it wasn't just fear she was expressing. It was frustration, anger, and blame. She had once again targeted Ava. "This is your fault," Karen yelled, her voice now shrill with panic. "This whole thing, It's because of you. I told you. You don't belong here. You're causing all of this." Ava looked at her in disbelief, her mouth slightly agape. The plane had just gone through a normal bout of turbulence. Everyone on board was safe, but Karen's mind had twisted the situation into something much darker, something irrational. Ava took a deep breath. She knew how this went. People like Karen didn't always need logic. They needed to be heard. But Ava wasn't going to sit in silence anymore. Not today. "Karen," Ava said, her voice firm but calm. "You need to stop. This is turbulence. It's part of flying. It's not my fault, and I'm certainly not the reason we're all fine. So stop blaming me and take a moment to breathe." Karen's face turned bright red, her eyes welling up with tears. Her panic was clearly escalating into something more dangerous now. "No," she shrieked. "I won't. You think you can talk to me like that? You think you can?" But before Karen could finish her sentence, the pilot's voice came through the intercom again, cutting off her rant. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the brief turbulence. Please remain in your seats and remain calm. We will be passing through some more turbulence in a few minutes. Please do not stand until we have reached smooth air. Thank you for your understanding." It was then that something unexpected happened. As the pilot spoke, there was a noticeable shift in the tone of his voice. It wasn't just the standard flight announcement. There was a clear authority in his words now. Ava could feel the weight of his command. The flight attendants, who had been serving drinks and snacks, paused and looked toward the cockpit, their faces tense. It was as though they all knew something was about to happen. A few seconds later, the pilot came over the intercom again, this time with a tone that brooked no argument. "This is your captain speaking once more. I'm aware of the disruption caused by certain passengers, and I want to remind everyone that we will not tolerate any further harassment or violent behavior on board. I am not afraid to turn this plane around if necessary." The sudden shift in the pilot's demeanor caught everyone off guard. The entire cabin went eerily quiet. "Ma'am." The flight attendant approached Karen's seat, her voice stern. "We will be informing the captain of your behavior. Please sit back and remain calm for the rest of the flight, or we will have no choice but to make further arrangements for your safety and the safety of the other passengers." Karen opened her mouth to protest, but the words caught in her throat. For the first time, it was clear that she had lost control. The passengers around her, once silent, began to whisper to one another, nodding in agreement. Ava could feel the atmosphere shift. People were starting to stand behind her. Karen, for the first time since she had boarded the plane, had no choice but to fall silent. She glared at Ava, but Ava didn't flinch. She wasn't afraid anymore. The next few minutes were filled with tension, but the plane seemed to settle into a temporary peace. The turbulence passed, and with it, the immediate danger. But Ava knew this wasn't over. The flight had just taken a turn, and the arrival at Los Angeles was still far away. Would Karen continue to make things difficult? Would the crew be able to maintain control of the situation? Ava wasn't sure, but one thing was clear. She had stood up for herself, and the passengers had begun to notice. The pilot's intervention had given everyone a sense of reassurance, and Ava felt her nerves settle just a little bit. The moments after the pilot's warning were some of the quietest the flight had seen. Most passengers sat in uneasy silence, some with their heads down, others nervously fidgeting. Ava, though, remained calm, her breathing steady as she tried to ignore the occasional glare from Karen. The plane continued on its course, the turbulence having subsided. But Karen's seething anger wasn't finished. Her furious mutterings grew louder now, each word dripping with resentment as she sat, stiff-backed and rigid, her arms crossed. Ava had learned to tune her out, focusing instead on her own thoughts. The conference was approaching, and she had to concentrate. But that didn't stop her from noticing when Karen turned to the flight attendants. "I demand to speak with the captain. This is completely unacceptable. You can't treat me like this." Karen's voice was sharp, rising in pitch with every passing second. The flight attendants exchanged wary glances. Ava could tell they had been through this before. They had their procedure, their rules, but nothing about this situation felt normal. As one flight attendant approached, Karen stood up abruptly. "I'm not sitting here next to her. It's an embarrassment. I'll be reporting all of you for this. You can't let someone like her sit next to me." She pointed at Ava, her face contorted with disgust. Ava closed her eyes briefly, her patience running thin. This was no longer just about her. Karen wasn't simply a disruptive passenger. She had become a symbol of something much larger. Ava wasn't going to let this woman, this moment, dictate her worth. She wasn't going to be anyone's target. "Ma'am," the flight attendant said softly but firmly, "please sit down. We will handle this issue. But if you continue to create a scene, we will have to take further actions. I ask that you remain seated until we land." But Karen wasn't listening. She was a whirlwind of anger now, her eyes wild and frantic, darting around as if she needed to find someone else to blame. The other passengers were starting to whisper again, murmurs of discomfort passing through the cabin. No one wanted to be part of the chaos, but no one could ignore it either. Ava shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She wasn't afraid, but she could feel the tension growing. The air was thick with anticipation. Would the situation escalate? Would Karen's rage be the catalyst for something worse? Ava glanced at the other passengers, most of them avoiding eye contact, too afraid to speak out. Then, in a move that stunned everyone, Karen grabbed the seat back in front of her and jerked it forcefully, knocking a drink tray from a nearby passenger's lap. The drink spilled onto the floor with a loud splash, and the passenger let out a startled yelp. The flight attendant rushed over, but Karen wasn't done. You see how they treat me. They let her sit here, and now you've ruined my clothes," she screamed, pointing directly at Ava again. Ava's hands tightened around the armrests, but she refused to react. It wasn't her fault. This was Karen's outburst, her decision to create chaos. The flight attendant stood tall, their voice steady but insistent. "Ma'am, you need to calm down now. I'm going to have to call security if you don't stop. This behavior is unacceptable." But Karen wasn't listening. Her face was red with anger, her hands shaking as she pointed at Ava again. "She's the problem. She should be kicked off the plane." The flight attendants looked toward the cockpit once more, and this time, the captain's voice came through the intercom with an unmistakable sense of authority. "This is your captain speaking. We have received several reports about disruptive behavior from a passenger. I want to make it clear that we take this matter very seriously. If this behavior continues, I will not hesitate to involve the authorities upon landing. We have a responsibility to ensure that all passengers are safe and comfortable. I ask that everyone comply with the instructions of our flight attendants and remain calm. Thank you." The cabin went silent. There was no denying the weight of the captain's words. Karen's face twisted with fury, but she remained seated. The flight attendants began moving quickly, checking on the other passengers and making sure everyone was secure. The tension had reached its peak. Ava, heart pounding in her chest, felt the eyes of every passenger on her now. It was clear who Karen had singled out. But despite the whispers, the murmurs, the glances in her direction, Ava didn't flinch. She held her ground. This was her moment, her silent victory. Karen slouched in her seat, muttering under her breath, her face burning red with humiliation. She was still furious, but the battle had shifted. The flight crew had stepped in, the captain had spoken, and now the whole cabin knew who was in control. It was then that something amazing happened. One by one, other passengers began to speak up. A man from the back of the plane stood and said, "Hey, I don't know what the problem is, but it's not her fault. We're all on this flight together." As the plane began its final descent into Los Angeles, the cabin was quieter than it had been since the flight started. The tension, though still present, seemed to have diminished. The support from the other passengers had made a significant difference. Ava sat back in her seat, her grip on the armrest finally loosening. She had held it together through all of this, and now, as they neared their destination, she could almost feel the weight lifting off her shoulders. But Karen wasn't finished yet. From her seat across the aisle, Karen huffed loudly, making sure everyone could hear. "I can't believe this," she muttered. "The whole flight, and it's still about her. She's the one who caused all this trouble, and now everyone's treating her like a hero." Her voice was thick with bitterness, her eyes darting around the cabin as if searching for an ally. "I should have reported this whole thing earlier." Ava exhaled quietly, trying to ignore her. She had already proven her point. Everyone on this plane knew what had happened, and no amount of Karen's complaining would change that. Still, Karen's venomous words stung, and Ava could feel the remnants of the day's stress creeping in. The final announcement came over the speaker, and the seatbelt signs flickered on. Passengers began to prepare for landing, returning to their normal routines, as if the storm had passed. But Karen's voice cut through the hum of the cabin. "You people are all the same." Karen spat out loud, her words intended to carry through the rows of seats. "You're all just a bunch of enablers. You let her get away with whatever she wants, and then you treat me like I'm the problem." Her fists were clenched in her lap, her entire body trembling with fury. Ava's pulse quickened again. There was something in the air, a sense that this wasn't over. Not yet. Her mind raced as she debated whether to speak up, to defend herself once again. But she realized she didn't need to. Her earlier silence had already said everything that needed to be said. Ava had already won. Yet, despite her inner resolve, Karen's words were still burning. It was a slow burn, like embers igniting within her, but Ava fought to keep her composure. She could feel her heartbeat pounding in her ears. Then, out of nowhere, another voice spoke up. This time, not a passenger, but the pilot himself. The intercom buzzed, and the captain's voice was steady, calm, and authoritative. "Ladies and gentlemen, as we make our final approach into Los Angeles, I want to personally thank you for your patience. We understand that travel can be stressful, but it is important to remember that we all share the same goal: to reach our destination safely. Our flight crew works hard to ensure everyone's comfort, and I expect all passengers to respect that." The captain's tone shifted slightly, adding just a touch more weight to his words. "I also want to remind everyone that if any passenger continues to disrupt the flight or make others uncomfortable, they will be asked to leave the aircraft immediately upon landing. We will not tolerate any behavior that threatens the safety or peace of those on board." The cabin fell silent. Ava couldn't help but smile to herself, a small, knowing smile. She had heard the message loud and clear. This was no longer just about her, but about every passenger who had endured the chaos. Karen, on the other hand, went rigid. The words from the captain stung her more than anything else. Ava had seen it in the way Karen's face fell, her eyes darting to the flight attendants, to the passengers, and then finally back to the window. The walls were closing in on her, and she could feel the shame creeping up from the depths of her anger. For the first time in the entire flight, Karen didn't have a response. But Ava knew that this moment, though triumphant, was only part of the journey. Karen wasn't done, but neither was Ava. They had both reached a turning point, one that would forever change how they saw each other. As the plane touched down and taxied toward the gate, the cabin lights flickered back on. Everyone began to stir, collecting their belongings and preparing to leave. Ava remained in her seat, her hand steady, her mind focused. She had made it through this chaotic ordeal, and now she could leave with her head held high. As the plane's doors finally opened and passengers began filing out, the tension in the air was palpable. Ava was one of the last to stand, her bag in hand, her thoughts racing. She had just survived a storm of chaos and hatred, but she wasn't sure what would await her next. Would the authorities take action? Would Karen continue to create problems? Or would she walk off the plane and disappear into the crowd? Ava took a slow breath, reminding herself that she had kept her composure. She had held her ground when Karen had tried to belittle her, and she had stayed calm despite the escalating confrontation. Eva wasn't sure what she expected at this point, but she knew that whatever happened, she was ready. As she moved toward the exit, she couldn't help but notice Karen standing near the gate, her eyes scanning the crowd. She still seemed tense, like she was waiting for someone to make the first move. The flight attendants were nearby, speaking with airport security. Their eyes briefly met Eva's, and she could sense that they were grateful for her patience and strength during the flight. Eva made her way down the ramp, her steps steady, her mind now focused on the conference ahead. This was a new chapter in her career, her first big medical conference. She couldn't afford to be distracted, no matter how the flight had ended. But as she walked, a sudden voice broke through her thoughts. "Eva," someone called from behind. She turned, surprised to see one of the flight attendants rushing toward her. The woman was breathless, her expression one of urgency. "Yes? Is everything all right?" Eva asked, her heart racing slightly. She wondered if something had happened with Karen. The attendant hesitated for a moment, then smiled. "Actually, yes. I just wanted to thank you for staying so calm back there. You handled that situation with more grace than most people would have." Eva blinked, not expecting this at all. "Thank you. But I wasn't sure what else to do. I just wanted to get through the flight in one piece." The flight attendant nodded. "I understand. But you should know that a few passengers, people sitting near you, have said something incredible about you. They noticed how you didn't fight back, how you didn't rise to Karen's level. And well, we just wanted to let you know that we really appreciate your strength." Eva's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected this kind of acknowledgement. It was a reminder that the impact of her silence and composure had been felt by others. She had remained calm, and in doing so, she had not only shown her own strength, but she had also made a quiet but powerful statement to everyone on that plane. Before Eva could respond, another voice broke in from behind them. It was Karen. "You." Karen snapped, pointing at Eva with a finger trembling from rage. "You think you can just walk away from all of this? You think you've won? You haven't." Eva sighed inwardly. She had been hoping that Karen would fade into the background, but it was clear she wasn't done. Karen pushed her way through the small crowd of passengers, making a beeline for Eva. Her face was twisted in anger, and her eyes burned with unrelenting fury. But before Karen could say another word, the flight attendants moved in quickly, standing between her and Eva. One of them spoke firmly. "Ma'am, we've asked you to remain calm. If you don't stop harassing this passenger, we will call airport security." Karen stopped, her mouth open as if to argue, but the words didn't come. She was no longer in control. The flight attendants stood their ground, and the moment her tantrum failed to gain any traction, Karen's anger seemed to deflate, leaving her standing there, sputtering in frustration. Eva couldn't help but feel a small sense of victory. She had remained composed throughout the entire ordeal, and now Karen's anger had nowhere to go. The tension was finally broken. With one final glare at Eva, Karen turned away, her shoulders slumped in defeat. She stalked off toward the exit, but Eva didn't look back. She had nothing left to prove.